The Green Revolution by Megan Kratz. The Green Revolution, which is also known as the Third Agricultural Revolution, is a set of research technology transfers innovatives. This set of research technology transfer took place between 1950 and 1960s. The definition of the Green Revolution is a large increase in crop production in developing countries achieved by the use of fertilizers, pesticides, and high-yield crop varieties. Chemical fertilizers, synthetic herbicides, and pesticides were just a few things that were formed to make it possible to supply crops with extra nutrients. Next, I'm going to explain the roles of the government. The government had some important roles as the Green Revolution. They include policies, research, and extension. Policies establish reasonable taxation systems. Research worked to ensure focus on poverty alternatives. And extensions improve extension service, training, and research facilities. By developing these things, they were able to control weeds, killed insects, and prevented diseases that ultimately would have hurt the crop's growth. High-yield crops were another development and hoped to produce more yield. A high-yield crop is agriculture crops. They have been bred, genetically modified, or fertilized to increase their production yields. Multiple cropping was also another thing implemented to help the rate of growth. Multiple cropping, or multi-cropping, is the practice of sequentially growing two or more crops in the same piece of land during one growing season instead of just one crop. Ultimately, this adds to the number of production of crops by utilizing more space. Even though, as you can probably already tell, there were a lot of positives with the Green Revolutions, there were also negatives. Some of the negatives were adverse impact on the environment in forms of deforestation, land degradation, loss of biodiversity, increase in greenhouse gases, and those are just a few of the fallbacks that resulted in the Green Revolution. Even though there were negatives, which there is in most things in life, I believe the positives outweigh them. Ultimately, the goal of the Green Revolution was to develop more food production, and I would say it was successful for fulfilling that goal. The rapid increase in wheat and rice yield in the developing countries, brought by an advantage in fertilizers and other chemical inputs, expanded food supplies in many developing countries. With the increase of food supply, the Green Revolution has added to the growth of population in the last few decades. As you can see, yield rates from the Green Revolution grew dramatically. Between the time period 1950 to 1998, these productions grew vastly. Grains went from 522 to 1,620. Cereals went from 542 to 1,854. Rice went from 668 to 1,928. And wheat went from 663 to 2,583. The option to grow more food on the same land, which, as you guys know, is called multiple cropping, which meant less forest or natural land needed to be converted to farmland to produce more food. The population of humans, because of this, increased 100% between the time period 1961 and 2008. The production of food rose 150%, and natural land converted to farms only increased by 10%. That extra land that might have used to been used for growing crops could now be utilized for wildlife and plants for natural habitat. As you all probably know, climate change brings alterations to the norm temperatures and weather patterns in various biomes and climates across the world. The change in climate ultimately affects organism habitats and crop yields. Drought in California impacts production of nuts, fruits, and vegetables, necessities that we rely on California for. India's east coast lacking rainfall limits the growth of corn, something else we rely on. Drought conditions in Europe, mainly around the Mediterranean, ultimately affect crop growth. Again, another thing the people rely on. What I just mentioned are just a few things people in the world consider necessities that they expect they can get and rely on. When these necessities lack or are vacant, starvation will occur. Next, I'm going to be talking about abiotic and biotic factors. As you can see, abiotic are non-living things. Some things include light, water, and nutrition, and temperature, air, soil, sunlight. Those are just a few things that impact the growth of crops ultimately. Some biotic factors, next, are living things. Biotic factors also affect crop production. Some examples of biotic factors are pests, insects, and diseases. A pest causes damage to our crops by feeding. Weeds also reduce crop productivity by competing with the main crop for nutrition and light. When these abiotic or biotic factors are missing that are needed for crop growth, no production can happen. When no growth of crops occur, starvation and famine comes. The Green Revolution is able to add and take away things crops need and don't need to develop the growth and production at a normal, rapid speed. In my personal opinion, I believe we are in need for another Green Revolution. After all, if we have the resources and the technology, these fertilizers, these substitutions to stop world hunger, it would amaze me that we wouldn't put them into action if we have these things. In a perfect world, climates would remain consistent, necessities to organisms would come as needed, and global warming wouldn't be a thing. Unfortunately, all of those things are present things in the universe right now. These are things and issues we come across every day. If precipitation is lower than usual, or the weather is hotter than normal, people who rely on crops to grow, to simply eat, will have to pay. The Green Revolution of the 1960s ultimately prevented starvation across the developing worlds. It gave people food. It saved so many lives from people who were about to go starving and die. Acting on these issues by creating things like the Green Revolution are a great temporary replacement when needed, and I believe we are in need of another Green Revolution in these developing countries who rely on food, who need food to survive like the rest of us and aren't able to get it because of these climate and weather factors that they can't control. The Green Revolution is related to ecology in many ways. Ecology is a branch of biology concerning interactions among organisms and their biophysical environment, which includes both biotic and abiotic components. As mentioned before, biotic and abiotic components are needed for the development of organisms, such as crops. Other things that ecology includes is environment, such as things like climate and weather, which are another two things that develop crop growth. I wanted to thank you for taking the time to learn and better understand what the Green Revolution actually is and how it's impacted by the science ecology.